I saw the car flip and thought, King hell. On a frosty January morning in 2019, 75-year-old local barrister Roy Warren was startled to see a Land Rover somersault across the A149 motorway at Babingley in Norfolk and roll onto its side. An elderly male voice could be heard shouting, "My legs! My legs!" The vehicle had collided with a blue minivan, now giving off plumes of smoke driven by a woman with a female passenger and a 9-month-old baby in the back seat. Warren got the screaming infant out, then rushed to the Land Rover to help extricate the driver, at which point the gobsmacked Warren had occasion to think fucking hell again. Shaken but uninjured, the Duke of Edinburgh was lifted up and staggered out. For some time, the 97-year-old Prince Philip had refused to consider the fact that he was too old to be behind the wheel. He was always a demon driver and never wore a seatbelt while careening around his estates. As soon as he totaled this Land Rover, he ordered a new one, and the next day was cautioned by the police after being photographed driving unbuckled. When the incident hit the news media, it triggered a national debate about getting geriatric menaces off the road. It doubtless caused Philip some grim amusement that the populist tabloids were now hollering that he should be driven around by a chauffeur. Wow, Prince Philip really is a fascinating character. Over the years, I've come across a lot about him, some of it from articles and biographies, and yes, some of it from The Crown. I know the show dramatizes certain things, maybe even exaggerates, but I do believe there's a lot of truth in the core story it tells. Philip comes across as a very strong personality. Given the background and the kind of family he comes from, there's obviously a deep sense of pride, ego, and self-respect. And honestly, being the husband of the monarch, especially a monarch like Queen Elizabeth II, whose reign spanned decades of change, could not have been easy. He had to operate in her shadow, constantly adjusting, sacrificing, adapting. And I don't doubt he had good qualities: loyalty, intelligence, probably a strong sense of duty. He stood by the Queen and, from what we know, offered her valuable counsel over the years. But then, every now and then, you hear these stories, moments where his worst traits come through. And that's when I can't help but think, oh, so that's where the kids got it from. The temper, the entitlement, the tantrums, the need to be the alpha in the room. That I don't take advice energy, it didn't come out of nowhere. He was, in the end, a man of contradictions, capable of deep commitment and discipline, but also of reckless, often childish behavior that doesn't reflect well on someone in his position. Still, he remains one of the most interesting figures in the royal family. In his retirement, Philip took himself off to his man cave at Wood Farm, the cozy and unpretentious royal property on the Sandringham estate, where he organized his papers, painted watercolors, and read history voraciously. He was often visited by Penny Romsey. She shared the Duke's love of painting, a quiet and unobtrusive passion for both. Still obsessed with technology, Philip often extolled the joys of his Kindle, until, disgusted by all the direct marketing of books that he didn't want to read, he threw it in the bathtub. Prince Philip, for all his sacrifices, clearly knew how to carve out space for himself. Between his routines, hobbies, and preferred company, he found real pockets of freedom. Outside the official duties, he seemed to live largely on his own terms, quietly and without much scrutiny. We've already mentioned the Penny Romsey story and the rumored affair, but that wasn't the only whisper. His private life, while discreet, ran in parallel to his royal role. Not admirable, maybe, but telling. What caught me off guard was his interest in the Kindle. For someone I never saw as tech-savvy, he had a real curiosity. Whether it was history or innovation, he stayed mentally active into his later years. Ironically, the discipline and sense of duty he had didn't really pass down to Charles or Andrew. They inherited the entitlement and fragility, but not much else. The real heir to both Philip and the Queen, Princess Anne, beloved, grounded, and consistent. As for Philip, minding his business might have been his best legacy in that family. Andrew had never forgiven Geit for working political back channels to get him removed as the UK's trade envoy in 2011 because of his general awfulness and dodgy financial deals. And Charles was outraged when Geit summoned a staff meeting of the 500 members of all three royal households to announce Philip's retirement and called for them to unite in support of the Queen. The thin-skinned Charles's reaction can be parsed as bloody outrageous. This should have been a Prince of Wales moment. Charles was about to turn 70, and was desperate to signify that his mother had begun her glide path down and he was now lifting off. While Geit understood that his role was to manage the delicate transition from the reign of a revered long-reigning queen to that of her less popular son, he is said to have believed that the convulsions of Brexit had made the queen an important unifying symbol of stability. Even though Charles now accompanied Her Majesty to the opening of Parliament and took on more of the palace investitures, it was Geit's view that the British people had to be reassured, in the middle of all the political turmoil, that the queen was not going anywhere yet. This was the very opposite of what Charles wanted. Charles went to Mummy and demanded Geit's head on a platter. In what was surely not her finest hour, the queen caved to her son's tantrum. The rare fraternal alliance of Andrew and Charles was too rattling for the 91-year-old monarch to resist. She showed her private anguish over Sir Christopher's unfair dismissal after 10 years of service by loading him up with honors on the way out and throwing him a farewell party for more than 400 guests at Buckingham Palace. Every senior royal attended except the backstabbing Charles and Andrew. There are many who believe that subsequent royal troubles would not have blown up so badly if the queen could have turned to Geit. If I have a real grievance with the queen, it's how she handled her sons and the ripple effect that's had on the monarchy. Charles and Andrew both benefited from her blind spots, but in different ways. With Charles, the queen started bending her principles far earlier than most people realize. She allowed him to marry a divorced woman, something she flatly denied her sister, Princess Margaret. And I truly believe Margaret would have had a far happier life and a more stable family had she been allowed to marry her first love, someone she never really got over. With Charles, it was always this pattern of reluctant concessions, frustration followed by resignation. She gave in not out of affection, but because she didn't know how else to deal with him. And that pattern has stuck. He still acts like a man-child, even as king. People may praise his administration, but I don't think he's carrying his mother's legacy forward in spirit. And then there's Andrew. The queen threw every bit of caution and principle out the window for him. For someone who lived her whole life as monarch first, mother second, she did a complete reversal when it came to Andrew. She protected him when he deserved it the least. And I refuse to believe she didn't know the kind of man he was. Maybe not every detail, but enough. The damage is done. Charles and Andrew, two grown men still behaving like spoiled heirs, are a result of choices made long ago. And while Philip may have tried to be stricter, the indulgence came from the queen. And unfortunately, the monarchy is still paying the price. Meanwhile, the insistent Meghan kept asking for palace meetings about how to shape her role, a role that was, to the palace, blindingly clear. It was to support the monarchy with a considered agenda of multiple local patronages and appearances, punctuated with overseas tours, judicially selected by the Foreign Office. To show Meghan how it was done, the Queen invited the family fledgling to accompany her a month after the wedding to open a 6-lane toll bridge in the town of Chester, near Liverpool. Harry and Meghan were then dispatched on an agreeably undemanding tour of Ireland. The Duchess arrived in Dublin in a skin-tight moss-green Givenchy skirt and top, rang the massive peace bell with Harry, attentively watched a game of hurling at Croke Park, and admired the young oak tree planted by the Queen on her own celebrated visit 6 years before. It was meat and potato royal stuff, but executed with an actress's elan. The Patty Harverson doctrine of all you have to do is smile and look as if you enjoy doing it paid off with ecstatic reviews. In 2018, there were 800,000 references to Meghan as a breath of fresh air. The Duchess, in fact, came up with 2 well-considered royal projects of her own. She created a book of recipes from immigrant women displaced by the tragic inferno that killed 72 residents of the Grenfell Tower in June 2017. The project was a winner on multiple levels. It was authentic. Meghan is a talented cook herself. It was compassionate, a way to remind the public and the media that the families were still bravely suffering after the cameras had moved on. And it was effective. Together, our community cookbook raised over £500,000 for the fire's victims and was an instant bestseller on Amazon. At a time when 37% of the residents of London were born outside the United Kingdom and their very status as residents was being impugned by vocal Little Englanders in the post-Brexit rancor, the sight of the Duchess of Sussex in an apron at the Almanara Mosque, churning rice in a cauldron alongside headscarved mothers, was a solid public relations success. No one in the royal family but Meghan could legitimately utter the words, "On a personal level, I feel proud to live in a city that can have so much diversity." The Grenfell Tower tragedy had exposed the existence of shameful racial and economic inequity in London, just a stone's throw from one of the city's most expensive neighborhoods, Notting Hill. It became a celebrity cause for the likes of Adele and Lily Allen by shining her own spotlight on the grassroots London cause du jour and marrying it to her kitchen cred. The new Duchess preserved her brand of foodie feminist activist royal. In another well-received move, she helped launch a clothing line for SmartWorks, a charity that provides a business wardrobe for needy women going on job interviews. Meghan had first visited the charity secretly 2 months before her wedding and eagerly returned 5 times. SmartWorks' mission included providing workplace coaching and styling sessions for their clients, some of which Meghan conducted herself. Not a handout, a handheld, she posted catchily on Instagram. The founder of SmartWorks, Juliette Hughes-Hallett, said she's a natural coach. She helps our clients feel safe, comfortable, and protected. There is a real natural empathy about her. There's something about her which is mighty. It was a win for the Sussex brand, upholding the working woman ethos versus Kate's stay-at-home mom template, and contributing Meghan's Tig sense of style to the usually glum fashion arena of thrift shops. Why are there so many lilac jackets in here, she pondered, while surveying the dowdy offerings in the SmartWorks racks. So, Meghan enters the royal family and immediately gets to work. What's that phrase she kept using? Hit the ground running. And honestly, she did. She showed up, got involved, and from the outside, it looked like things were actually going pretty well. At this stage, I don't see a problem. It looked like a win-win. The royal family gets a modern, global, media-savvy asset, and Meghan gets the platform to do meaningful work. Now, I know comparisons to Kate always stir things up, but let's be real for a moment. There is some truth to that contrast. Kate has always taken more of a stay-at-home, traditional royal wife approach. And I'm just going to say it, she's never really presented herself as an independent woman. She didn't have a career or identity of her own before marrying William. Even her choice of university and subject were clearly influenced by him. That whole story doesn't exactly scream agency. So when Meghan came in with a completely different style, independent, outspoken, proactive, it was a real shift. And at this point in the story, Meghan's approach actually feels like the winning one. She brought energy, vision, and a sense of modernity that, frankly, the firm desperately needed. It was all an excellent run-up before the higher stakes of the Sussexes' 16-day tour of Australia, New Zealand, and Fiji in October 2018. Meghan's Commonwealth debut was a smashing success. Echoes of Charles and Diana's famous first Australia conquest were irresistible in the number and excitement of the fans who turned out. Meghan was photographed in full Diana mode, hugging toddlers who gave her flowers, dropping to her knees to clasp both hands of an ancient granny in a wheelchair in Sydney, and clapping with delight at a baby koala bear at the Taronga Zoo. Harry, too, seemed in his finest form, opening and closing his 4th Invictus Games in the middle of the tour. It helps to be in love with your wife and to be proud of her rather than jealous. Unlike Charles, who seethed at suddenly playing second fiddle to Diana's charisma, Harry had star power in his own right. But for the first time, he also had a woman he loved to share it with. So, Meghan must have been thrilled with it all, right? No, she apparently hated every second of it. She found the itinerary of engagements pointless, a former palace employee told me. She didn't understand why things were set up in that way. Instead of being excited when thousands of people showed up at the Opera House, it was very much like, what's the purpose? I don't understand this. This being the representational role of the British monarchy and its traditional agenda, rather than the focus on causes she wanted to spotlight. Megmania, as it was called in the Australian press, was markedly more enthusiastic than the reception for William and Kate on their own Aussie tour in 2014. Meghan seemed to interpret the success as a call for Brand Sussex to be elevated in the palace hierarchy. Her aggrieved mood mirrored Harry's. He fulminated over the customary presence of the royal press pack, even though the copy they filed was overwhelmingly complimentary. The Times correspondent Valentine Lowe remembers him being pretty grumpy. When the palace team encouraged him to go to the back of the plane and chat up the traveling press, Harry unendearingly told them, "Thanks for coming, not that anyone invited you." Did he forget that it was a taxpayer-funded trip? This is one of those moments where I actually want to pause and say Meghan was doing great. The Australia tour looked like a win. She was charming, articulate, engaged, glowing, and the public loved her. You can't fake that level of warmth from crowds. And frankly, if you compare her performance to Kate's more reserved, ceremonial presence, Meghan came off as the more dynamic, modern royal. You can see why people were excited. It was new energy. But here's where it gets complicated. Because while everything looked like it was going brilliantly underneath it all, Meghan was miserable. She didn't buy into the symbolic value of these engagements. She didn't want to play the pageantry game. And if you don't believe in the job you're performing, no matter how good you are at it, it's going to burn you out fast. That said, what strikes me the most is how completely Meghan seems to have misunderstood the nature of monarchy. This isn't Hollywood. You don't get to redefine the institution just because the spotlight happens to like you more. And when she saw how well the public responded, not just well, but better than they had to William and Kate, I think she saw it as a mandate to elevate brand Sussex. But the palace doesn't work that way. Popularity isn't currency in that system. Deference is. Harry's reaction just makes it worse. The press pack wasn't heckling him. They were covering him and doing so favorably, but he's clearly carrying decades of unresolved resentment. That line, "Not that anyone invited you," she says it all. It's petty, it's ungrateful, and it completely ignores the fact that, yes, actually, taxpayers did invite them. That's the job. That's the deal. So this was the moment it all started cracking. Not because the public rejected Meghan, but because she couldn't stand the role the public expected her to play. And Harry, instead of offering perspective or balance, doubled down on the bitterness. They wanted to rewrite the rules, and there's little place for that in this institution, at least not from the spare. The Queen, determined not to fail Meghan, as it was privately recognized Diana had been failed, offered Meghan the ear of her most senior lady-in-waiting, Lady Susan Hussey, a wily court infighter who had been around since 1960, and Samantha Cohen, a brisk Australian palace veteran who was the monarch's most trusted communications aide, and who agreed at the Queen's personal request to return from the private sector specifically to support the new Duchess's learning curve. In early 2019, Her Majesty personally bestowed on Meghan 2 plum honors. For 45 years, the Queen had been patron of the National Theatre. She granted the juicy cultural honor to the former actress. And in an index that she did indeed appreciate the success of the Australia tour, she named Meghan Vice President of the Queen's Commonwealth Trust, with a remit to support young people, especially women and girls. It was a clear signal that the Sussexes would have their own high-profile territory as ambassadors of the organization that is one of the Queen's most treasured expressions of her sovereign power. Meghan was said to be genuinely chuffed with this new platform. For years, she had dreamed of UN goodwill ambassadorships. Now she had something even better: the gravitas of the Commonwealth imprimatur. The organization's dusty image was ripe for a rebrand. The world's most appealing royal couple could sprinkle their stardust and bring its mission of collaboration and outreach alive with new purpose. It was soft power with bells on, especially in the post-Brexit era when Britain's trade alliances were being redrawn and its internationalism was in some peril. But modernizing the imagery of the Commonwealth's mission would take not only care and tact, but time. And time, it seems, was something that Meghan did not have. The grating problem was money. It was becoming clear to Meghan that without financial freedom, every effort to fulfill the Sussexes' global dream was hitting a wall. Sharing office resources with the Cambridges meant they were junior partners in an underfunded operation. Harry was at the mercy of his father's watchful dispensation of funds, his grandmother's largesse for a roof over his head, his elder brother's prior claims on the allocation of budget, and the approval of tour expenses from the sovereign grant. See, this is the part of the story that actually frustrates me the most, because this was the moment the Queen really tried. After everything the firm had been accused of with Diana, the coldness, the neglect, the lack of support, this was a clear attempt to not repeat the same mistakes with Meghan. She was given real institutional backing, not lip service, actual resources, people, and platforms. Susan Hussey, Samantha Cohen, the National Theatre, the Queen's Commonwealth Trust. That's not nothing, that's huge. And for a former actress who used to dream about being a UN Goodwill Ambassador, this wasn't a consolation prize. This was bigger. A role rooted in legacy, soft power, global reach. If she'd leaned into this slowly, smartly, she could have become the modern face of the monarchy. But that would have required one thing: patience. And this is where I think Meghan's biggest flaw shows up. She wanted transformation now. She wanted impact, control, and global influence. And fast. And I get it. She's ambitious. She's used to calling her own shots. But this was the one place where power doesn't work like that. Then there's the money. And I do sympathize here. It's ridiculous that 2 high-profile working royals had to beg, borrow, and share budget lines with their relatives. They were boxed in, status without autonomy. And when you're trying to build something, that's infuriating. But again, this wasn't a startup, it was the crown. You either play the long game or you burn out. And sadly, they burned out. Many Americans were baffled by the British media outcry about the £2.4 million spent from the sovereign grant on doing up Frogmore. Such a sum wouldn't even buy a two-bedroom teardown in the Montecito neighborhood in California, where the couple lives today. A Daily Mirror journalist once explained to me that, though the tabloids feast on negative scoops, all they really want is a new narrative to milk, whether it's saccharine or sensational. They hadn't had a juicy story of royal real estate extravagance since the 1990s, with the Queen's gifts of South York to Andrew and Fergie, and the overly grandiose Bagshot Park to Edward and Sophie Wessex. The Frogmore Follies became a fun new episode. Inventive hacks churned out Spenderella myths about Meghan's overweening demands for a lavish copper bathtub and a private yoga studio, with an ongoing refrain of, "Who does she think she is?" This whole Frogmore drama was peak British tabloid hypocrisy. And let's be clear, the tabloids weren't even outraged because of fiscal responsibility. They were bored, they needed a new villain. Meghan gave them just enough glamour, just enough foreignness, just enough difference to spin into scandal. A sulphurous cloud hung over the House of Sussex. As a young, celebrated couple expecting their first child, they should have been radiating felicity. Instead, they had a beleaguered air. Harry had waited so long for this personal happiness, pining for a family of his own, while his brother settled into a fulfilling domestic life. But his wife's discontents were contagious, and he blamed the press for destroying her morale. He just seemed incredibly unhappy, partly because she was unhappy, a palace source told me. Meghan found England itself an exhausting conundrum. Like many Americans, she felt excluded or rebuffed by British reserve, which, among the royal family and the palace, was at the extreme end of the usual upper-class denial of emotion. "I really tried to adopt this British sensibility of a stiff upper lip. I really tried," she later told ITV's Tom Bradby. She found it draining to traverse the chasms between her California effusiveness and British understatement. It was her earnestness versus their irony, her explicitness versus their words unsaid. This is one of those passages where you can feel the emotional exhaustion leaking through the page. They were supposed to be in a golden phase, newly married, baby on the way, global popularity at an all-time high. And yet, they were miserable. Not just behind the scenes, but visibly, awkwardly, publicly miserable. Harry, poor guy, had finally gotten what he wanted. A woman he loved and a family of his own. But instead of feeling fulfilled, he was isolated, defensive, and completely wrapped up in Meghan's unhappiness. They became that couple who only talked to each other at parties. Never a good sign. Instead of helping her navigate that, Harry internalized the backlash and became angrier, more withdrawn. It was a feedback loop of grievance, one that the monarchy was wholly unprepared to interrupt.